There's a specific smell that comes with a place that's been loved for a long time. Cedar and lemon oil, and something underneath that I can only describe as permanence. My grandparents built that cottage on Lac Beauvert in 1971, and my parents inherited it when my grandmother passed. I grew up spending every July there, watching my father restain the deck every single summer without complaint. Watching my mother plant the same perennials along the stone path each spring, even though the frost always took half of them. They never talked about what that place cost them to keep. They just kept it. Property taxes, maintenance, a new roof in 2019 that nearly broke them quietly. They didn't say a word about the money. They just paid it and showed up the following July with the same folding chairs and the same tin of Earl Grey. When my mother called me on a Thursday afternoon in October 2 years ago to tell me they wanted to transfer the cottage into my name, I didn't say anything for a long time. I just sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store and let the words settle. She said, "We want to know it goes to you. We want to know while we're still here to see it." I drove home without the groceries. I was 31 at the time, married to my husband for 3 years. We had met in grad school in a seminar on environmental policy that neither of us ended up working in, and we had built something together that felt, for most of those early years, like genuine partnership. He was thoughtful. He remembered things. He showed up when it counted. I believed in him the way you believe in someone when you've only seen the parts of them that show up well under normal conditions. The transfer happened in November. My parents drove to my lawyer's office in Edmonton, both of them dressed like they were going to church, and they signed the papers that moved 53 years of family history into my name alone. My name, not a joint name, not a shared name. My mother had been clear about that, gently but firmly, in the way she was clear about everything important. She said, "It came from our family. We want it to stay in our family." I understood what she meant, and I didn't argue. My husband was not in the room. He knew it was happening. He had said he understood. I believed that too. The first signs were so quiet I nearly missed them. My husband started mentioning his brother more often in conversation, and I didn't register it as a pattern because individually, none of it seemed like anything. His brother Felix had been living in Calgary in a rental that he hated. He was 36, between jobs in a way that had been going on for about 2 years, dating a woman named Petra who I had met twice and found perfectly fine. They were, according to my husband, struggling. Rent was expensive. Calgary wasn't working out. They needed a change. I listened the way you listen to background noise, sympathetically but distantly. Then one evening in March, my husband sat down at the kitchen table and told me he had been thinking. He said Felix and Petra needed somewhere to stay for the summer. He said the cottage was sitting empty from September to June anyway. He said it seemed like the obvious solution. I put down my tea. I asked him to say that again because I wanted to make sure I had heard it correctly. He said it again. I told him I needed to think about it, which was the diplomatic version of what I was actually feeling, which was a kind of cold clarity. The cottage was not sitting empty. The cottage was exactly where it was supposed to be, held in trust by the people who had always cared for it, waiting for July the way it always had. Emptiness was not an invitation, especially not an invitation I had extended. He said, "It's family." I said, "Yes." My family's. He looked at me like I had said something unreasonable. That look bothered me more than the request. The conversation ended without resolution, which I mistook for a pause. It wasn't a pause. He had already made a plan, and he was simply waiting for the right angle to present it from. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday, he told me his mother was coming to visit, and she had some thoughts she wanted to share. His mother, who I will simply call my mother-in-law, arrived on a Tuesday with a carry-on bag and the energy of someone who had come to settle something. She was a small, composed woman who had an ability to make every room feel like a negotiation. She was not cruel. I want to be accurate about that. She was not a villain. She was simply a woman who had decided that what was good for her children was good for the world, and that the universe generally agreed with her. She toured my kitchen like she was appraising it. She commented on the cabinet space. She looked out the window at the backyard and said something about it being a shame to leave a yard that size without a vegetable garden. Then she sat down across from me with her hands folded and she began. She talked about family. She talked about how her youngest son had always been sensitive and had never had an easy time finding his footing. She talked about how Petra was good for him, grounding him, but that they needed stability in order to really build something. She talked about how a summer at the cottage would give Felix a chance to reset. She talked about how it was sitting empty. Every sentence was designed to make disagreement sound selfish. I had the feeling of listening to something that had been rehearsed, not in a cynical way, but in the way of someone who had rehearsed it because they believed it completely and wanted to get it right. Then she said, and I want to get this exactly right because I have replayed it many times. She said that it would help enormously if Felix and Petra had a set of keys before the weather turned so they could get up there and start airing the place out. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator. I could hear my husband somewhere in the other room, the small sounds of a person pretending not to be listening. I felt something move through me that I did not expect. Not anger, not the panicked urge to defend myself. Something slower than that. Something that felt like the specific gravity of knowing exactly what was happening and exactly what I was going to do about it. I looked at my mother-in-law's face. It was the face of someone who expected to receive what she was asking for, not out of malice, out of habit. I set my hands flat on the table. I took one breath. And I told her I needed to tell her something first, before we went any further, because I thought there was a misunderstanding that we should clear up while all of us were present. I did not raise my voice. I am not a person who raises my voice, not because I'm passive, but because I have never needed to. The words were enough. I told her the cottage was not mine to offer in the way she was imagining. I told her that before I could explain what I meant, she needed to understand what that property actually was. Not on paper, in reality. I told her about my grandfather building it in 1971 with lumber he sourced himself from a supplier in Jasper because he didn't trust the prices in Edmonton. I told her about my grandmother refinishing the kitchen table by hand the summer I was 7, and how I had sat on the floor and handed her sandpaper when she asked for it. I told her about my father restaining that deck every summer for 20 years without a single summer off, and about my mother's perennials dying in the frost every spring, and coming back planted again the following May. I told her about the roof in 2019 and what it cost, and the fact that my parents had not mentioned it to me until after it was finished because they didn't want me to worry. I told her that when my parents transferred that property into my name, they were not giving me an asset. They were placing 53 years of themselves into my hands. Every July. Every quiet sacrifice that I only fully understood when I was old enough to look back and count them. And I was not going to hand a set of keys to someone who had never set foot on that property and called it a favor to family. My mother-in-law's expression changed, not dramatically. It was a slow change, the kind that happens when a person recalibrates, when the room they expected to walk into turns out to have different walls than the ones they planned for. Her hands, which had been resting on the table with that relaxed confidence of someone who anticipated compliance, moved slightly. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the table. I heard my husband come to the doorway. I didn't turn around. I continued. I told her I had nothing against Felix. I told her I genuinely hoped he found his footing. I told her I had no desire to create distance between my husband and his family, and that she was welcome in our home as a guest, and that our guest room was available to her tonight if she needed it. But that the conversation about the cottage, about keys, about Felix and Petra, spending a season in a place that my family had protected across 3 generations, that conversation was finished. It had ended the moment she asked for keys to a property whose history she did not yet know. There was a silence that lasted long enough to feel like a full minute, though it probably wasn't. My mother-in-law picked up her coffee cup. She set it down again. She said quietly that she hadn't realized. I told her that was exactly why I had explained it. She left that afternoon, not with anger, not with a scene. She left with something quieter, the recalibration of a person who had walked in with one set of assumptions and was leaving with a different understanding of the territory. My husband drove her to the hotel she had originally booked and canceled in anticipation of staying with us. He came home 2 hours later and sat down in the living room and didn't speak. I let the silence be there. I have learned that silence is sometimes the most honest thing in the room. When he finally spoke, he did not defend his mother. He did not defend himself either, not immediately. He said he had made assumptions he shouldn't have made. He said he had treated something that belonged to my family as though it were a resource available to his, and he could see now what that looked like from where I was standing. I told him I appreciated him saying that. He asked me why I hadn't told him earlier, when he had first brought it up, how serious it was. I had to think about that question honestly, because it was a fair one. I told him I had thought it would dissolve on its own. I told him I had assumed we were on the same page because I had explained the cottage to him, the full history of it, and he had nodded and said he understood. I told him that I had mistaken his understanding of the facts for an understanding of the meaning, and that those are different things, and I should have been clearer earlier. He said he should have listened more carefully. We stayed in that room for a long time. Not fighting. Just talking. The way we should have been talking for months before any of this had happened. What came out in those conversations, the ones that happened over the following weeks, was not just about the cottage. It was about a pattern that had been forming slowly in our marriage, the pattern of his family's needs being treated as urgent, and my family's boundaries being treated as flexible. It had shown up in smaller ways before, ways I had noticed but not named, and it had taken the cottage to name it clearly. That part was uncomfortable, genuinely uncomfortable. Not because my husband was a bad person, but because neither of us had been paying enough attention to it, and now we were paying attention to it all at once. Felix and Petra found a sublet in Calgary. It worked out fine. I don't say that with satisfaction, just with accuracy. They found something and it worked. My mother-in-law and I have spoken a handful of times since then, and it is the careful, respectful conversation of two people who have arrived at a mutual understanding through a moment neither of them fully expected. It is not warm, not yet, but it is honest. And I have come to believe that honesty is sometimes the more durable version of warmth. It asks less of you. It doesn't require you to perform something you don't feel. It just asks you to see what is real and to speak from there. My parents still don't know most of what happened. My mother would spend weeks worrying. My father would go quiet in the particular way he goes quiet when something he loves has been threatened, and I didn't want to put that into him. They did not need to carry that. It wasn't theirs to carry. What I know is this. I drove up to the cottage alone in early July, the first summer after all of it. I pulled into the gravel laneway and sat in the car for a minute before getting out. The cedars along the property line were exactly where they had always been. The stone path my mother had laid needed weeding, which I did that afternoon. The deck needed a new coat of stain, which I applied the following morning with the same brush my father had always used, the one still hanging on the nail in the shed where he had always left it. The cottage smelled like cedar and lemon oil and something underneath that I still cannot fully describe. Permanence, maybe. The specific weight of a place that has been loved across decades by people who showed up for it every summer without being asked. I opened the windows to let the July air in. I made tea. I sat in my grandmother's chair on the deck and watched the light change on the water the way it always had, the way it would keep doing long after any of us were there to see it. The keys were in my pocket, where they belong.